We think of water as something that comes from a stream, and it does. But it also comes to the stream. And our water security, how clean it is, how bad the spring floods get, how cold and abundant our summer water supply is, depends on how it gets there.
Based on work done by many researchers who have looked at particularly the Old Man over the last, or flow rates in the Old Man over the last 100 years, it's not that climate changes in our future, we're actually experiencing it now. Because there's something like 25% less water in the Old Man now as there was 100 years ago.
25% less water in the Old Man in terms of the natural flow, or because it's been taken out?
Because of natural flow.
Wow, that's a big reduction.
Yeah. And then when you add, diversions and so forth, that just exacerbates the issue.
And of course, we're not on a trend that says we're going to need less water in the future. We're going to need more water in the future.
Apparently there's more water drinkers amongst us than there was before.
Water is life. In southern Alberta, we all know that. Here, a few relatively small rivers, the Bow, Highwood, Old Man, Belly, and St. Mary's, support more than 2/3 of all the irrigated agriculture in Canada. Growing cities like Calgary, Lethbridge, and Medicine Hat draw precious water from those rivers. Cottonwood forests, trout, geese, pelicans, deer, and countless other native animals rely on those rivers for habitat. Water sustains not only life itself, but also our quality of life. This is where our water comes from. A strip of forested land and bunchgrass meadows in the lee of the Rocky Mountains, public land that was reserved for watershed protection as far back as the 1880s. Almost all of Alberta's water originates as winter snows and spring rains on the eastern slopes and foothills. It doesn't come from the streams, it comes to the streams from the land. So, how we use the land determines the health of our creeks and rivers. Alberta's water future depends on good land stewardship because every land use decision is a water management decision. Lauren Fitch is a professional biologist who for many years was responsible for southern Alberta's trout streams and wildlife habitats. His decades of working to keep streams healthy have led him to focus not so much on the streams themselves as on the landscapes they drain from.
Fish are a product of their watershed. So everything we do in a watershed runs by or through a fish. And so if the fish populations are not doing well, it tells us something about how we have treated our watersheds. And clearly we have not treated our watersheds very well. So, that's the short story about where we're at compared to where we were.
Water managers sometimes build dams to store water in reservoirs, but that can do a lot of harm. Dams block fish migrations and rearrange river flows so that native plants and animals no longer have natural habitats. The artificial reservoirs actually waste a lot of water because our dry foothills winds evaporate it away. And if the upstream landscape is damaged by unwise land use, those reservoirs quickly fill with eroded silt, storing mud instead of water. The biggest, best, and most important water reservoir in our prairie headwaters is actually the land itself. Every year, it traps, stores, and releases all the water we need. The key to a healthy water future Maybe simply to take care of that reservoir, to make the most of the land's ability to store water, and to minimize any land uses that might cause it to leak. If the land is healthy, a lot of the snowmelt and spring rains soak into the ground. A healthy watershed stores most of the spring runoff underground, in soil and rock, and releases it slowly throughout the rest of the year. But if the vegetation is damaged, and the soil is exposed and compacted from too much wear and tear, water runs away fast in the spring. And once the spring flood ends, the water is gone, leaving streams shrunken during the hot summer when we most need good flows. Winter snows grow deep on the sheltered sides of our windy mountains and under the canopy of mountain and foothills forests. Snow gets carried and redeposited by wind. Vegetation, from tussocks of bunchgrass to forests of subalpine fir and pine, traps the snow and holds its water in cold storage. Some of the snow gets caught in the branches of trees. Up there, the dry winter winds can turn it right back into water vapor through a process called sublimation. We get a lot more water from the snowpack on the ground than from snow intercepted by the forest canopy. But that forest canopy protects our water supply too. It blocks wind and sun, and that helps the snowpack below to melt slowly in the spring, giving meltwater time to seep into the ground rather than all running off at once. The branches of trees and the underbrush and mosses and grasses on the forest floor diffuse the power of falling rain too. Big raindrops falling hard from the sky are broken by vegetation into fine spray and slow drips before they reach the ground. That reduces soil erosion and improves the ability of the rain to soak in. Healthy vegetation helps turn both snowmelt and rainfall into groundwater.
Most of the Front Ranges were covered with glaciers until about 12 to 15,000 years ago. And they left all this debris. We call this glacial till. It's just a jumble of rocks and boulders and gravel and cobbles and clay. And it was just sort of dumped loosely on the landscape when the glaciers melted back. And then in the 10 to 12,000 years since then, this thin layer of soil has built up underneath vegetation. You can see how small the layer of vegetation, the layer of good soil really is. When the snow melts or the rain falls and it goes into the ground, it goes down through the root channels that the vegetation has cut, penetrates into this porous material, and then it has to move downhill and down slope through this jumble of glacial till. It takes it a long time. There's a lot of friction. There's a lot of resistance to movement. So the water that comes in here in the spring might not actually emerge at the bottom of the hill for another 2, 3, 4, even months, even a year or two. And when it does come through, it's being cleaned. This is like a giant filter. It comes out clean and cold. As soon as you disturb that surface layer, first of all, you remove all those pathways, those roots. You can see all the tangled roots that are hanging out of the vegetation there that create the channels that allow groundwater to penetrate. And then all the fine material that's being developed in the soil becomes vulnerable to erosion. And eventually you're right back down to where you were 15,000 years ago when the glaciers retreated. So this is why protecting the vegetation cover and protecting those shallow young soils is critical to water health, because it sets up the whole process by which we get groundwater, and groundwater is the process by which we get springs that keep our streams healthy and alive all year round.
Underground, that water moves slowly. It has to work its way down root channels and between soil and stone particles, following the path of least resistance through the earth until it emerges at last as clean, cold spring water. Groundwater springs keep streams from becoming too warm and shallow for trout and other species during the summer. The slow release of groundwater ensures that the water is still available when we need it the most. Strip away the vegetation and the water cycle changes completely. Snow melts too fast in the spring. Rain slaps hard into the exposed soil and washes it loose. Rapid spring runoff sends dangerous, muddy floods down to our communities. With less groundwater recharge, springs dry up sooner and contain less water, so our summer streams shrink and sicken, and downstream communities often face water rationing. And our artificial water storage reservoirs fill with eroded mud, shortening their useful lifespans.
Yeah, if we tended to look at the watershed, particularly the ability of watersheds to store water in shallow groundwater, instead of just our artificial reservoirs, we might think differently about how we manage that watershed to increase its ability to first of all, capture water, and second of all, to store it. Recalling that the reason that rivers flow over the winter is that there was water stored in the spring and summer.
In the ground.
In the ground.
A watershed is a landscape with a living stream at its heart. In 21st century Alberta, however, we have very few of those landscapes that aren't busy with human activity and marked by the evidence of choices we have made. In the eastern slopes headwaters of our prairie rivers, we influence water in a lot of ways. We mine coal. We harvest timber. We graze cattle. We build roads. We camp, fish, hunt, and explore. Every one of those things has the potential to change the land. And every change in the land shows up in the streams that drain east into the prairies. The key to keeping a watershed healthy is simply to keep land disturbance to a minimum, especially the kinds of disturbance that damage vegetation and soils. A few narrow trails set well back from streams and wetlands and carefully designed to prevent runoff are better than many trails. Poorly located trails that slice steeply downslope always trap surface water and become sluiceways for erosion. Reclaiming and revegetating them makes sense if water security matters. Large-scale industrial disturbance like mining and forest harvest can damage streams even at a distance because they disrupt groundwater recharge and increase the rate of runoff in spring and after summer storms. Even domestic livestock can be a problem if they're allowed to graze so heavily that they damage the vegetation, or to linger too long in wet places where they trample down stream banks and wetlands. Good range management actually improves groundwater recharge, but poor range management keeps streams chronically muddy and unhealthy. The health of a stream is a measure of how well we are all taking care of the land. So, what actually happens when the landscape releases water to a headwater stream? It's complicated because a headwater stream doesn't just move water, it moves sediment too. Rocks, gravel, sands, and silt. Dead trees too. The power of moving water can be immense. That's particularly true in the spring, when melting snows and spring rains team up to bring large amounts of water off the landscape. Once the ground is saturated, water has to run off overland. It all ends up in the stream. And for every doubling of the amount of water in a stream, the power of that water to erode and move sediments increases fourfold. That's why streams often rearrange their channels. Spring flood flows can be strong enough to move the whole stream bed and to wash away exposed banks, especially banks that aren't protected by the tangled roots of streamside vegetation. But the power of the water changes as it flows, decreasing in areas of low flow and increasing in areas of high flow. Most of the finer sediment simply gets redeposited in places where the flow is weakest. On the outsides of stream bends, land erodes and trees wash out. On the insides of bends, new deposits of gravel, sand, and silt accumulate. They are like fresh garden beds, For willows, poplars, fireweed, and other floodplain plants, the washed out trees are important too. They become new habitat and hiding places for mink, trout, sandpipers, and other wildlife. After the spring floods are finished, the floodplain explodes with life. Riparian areas, those narrow mosaics of green vegetation that line our creeks and rivers, contain far more wildlife diversity than the whole rest of the landscape. Perhaps our most important partner in keeping streams well watered, while also building bigger riparian areas, is the common beaver.
I think for many of us to grapple with this is that maybe our best idea for the future is ensuring that our headwaters are managed well for things like water capture and water storage. You know, that speaks to how we manage forests, timber harvest, how we manage grazing, how we look at critters like beavers and their ability to help us through the cycles of drought and flood.
I mean the guys that build the dams for free.
The guys that build them and maintain them for free.
Yes. And build them in the right places.
And build them in the right places.
Most people in the world, most countries, are pushing for agendas that have many different solutions that are all kind of used simultaneously. So you wouldn't just build a dam and have water being stored in the reservoir. You'd employ a whole range of solutions. And some of those solutions are nature-based. And having beaver and healthy beaver in a stream ecosystem where they can build beaver dams that pond water is one type of these natural solutions. So I don't think beaver are the only way to move forward. I think they're part of a larger solution, but we've been doing a lot of research on showing how beaver affect hydrological processes, including how they affect groundwater resources, how they affect surface water resources, and how they affect stream flow. And what we're really finding is that beaver are incredibly important in the ecosystems in the Rocky Mountains, certainly throughout Kananaskis, where we've been doing the research. They promote groundwater moving from the surface water system, and they shunt that water into the groundwater system, and some of that water flows back to the stream during these low flow periods. So they're really important when the streams are quite dry in keeping water flowing. In fact, in 2017, many of the streams in Kananaskis, the smaller streams in Kananaskis, went dry, but those with beaver ponds on them did not.
Beavers don't just store water in the ponds behind their dams. They can store as much as 10 times more water in the soil around those ponds. In spring, beaver dams slow floodwaters and reduce the intensity of downstream floods. Because they slow the runoff, they also trap silt so that it builds soil rather than clogging the downstream riverbed. In summer, water seeping from beaver meadows keeps streams well watered. Many foothills valleys that used to have beaver colonies no longer do. Bringing them back would be a smart plan. The powerful spring flows flush the finest silt and mud right out of the stream and deposit it up on the floodplain. Those spring floods cleanse and renew habitat for fish, like the threatened native West Slope cutthroat trout and the bull trout. The freshly cleaned gravels allow cold, oxygen-rich water to reach trout eggs hidden there and to nourish the young trout when they hatch. Strange as it might seem, a muddy spring flood actually results in clean summer gravel because the force of so much water sorts and separates all the sediment. But it isn't normal for a stream to turn muddy after a summer rain, and the effect of that mud is much different. In summer, the stream doesn't have enough water to flush the fine sediments very far, and of course the stream has no way to move that silt onto the floodplain. Instead, the mud settles into the gravel, clogging it, and choking fish eggs and baby fish and the insects that fish live on.
This is a designated off-highway vehicle trail that goes right through a stream that's used by native cutthroat trout. So this is important habitat for them. And this, to their credit, the users have built a bridge that allows them to avoid going in the creek, and most of them are using it. So this is a really positive step. This is how you integrate recreational use, motorized recreational use, with protecting the health of the watershed and the health of the stream. But it's not enough, because if you look, the approach still comes down a straight hill and goes straight towards the creek. So every time we have a thunderstorm in the summer, it picks up any silt it can find on anywhere up that slope and drives it straight down that gully into this creek. So although the users aren't wrecking the creek, a badly designed trail is still doing damage to the creek. Getting it right involves diverting our trails so that they don't bring silt straight into the stream, and doing things like providing a bridge for the users to use.
So that's 11 feet wide, about 2.5 feet deep by 1. So that's 275 cubic feet, about 2,000 pounds, a little over 2,000 pounds, or a ton of sediment has disappeared over the years from this cut.
Just the one foot of it, though.
1 linear foot. And
Wow.
of course, in the Livingstone Porcupine Hills, there's about 4,000 kilometers, so several thousand miles of these linear features, all of which lead downhill because this is steep country, and inevitably this sediment, this ton from 1 linear foot added to the 1 ton from the next linear foot, added to the ton from the next linear foot, and so on, all flows downhill following the immutable laws of gravity and into, in this case, Dutch Creek.
Right.
Over the years, our headwater streams have developed a dynamic equilibrium between flooding and low flows, erosion and deposition. That dynamic equilibrium is reflected in the quality of the riparian environment, that green ribbon of life along each creek and river. Our wise and responsible use of the headwaters landscape can sustain that equilibrium. If streams and rivers have good summer flows, healthy native trout populations, and clean stream beds, then we'll know that we're getting it right. But we aren't quite there yet. A living stream is like the report card of a civilization. Western historian and novelist Wallace Stegner once wrote in his book The Sound of Mountain Water, "One cannot be pessimistic about the West. This is the native home of hope. It has a chance to create a society to match its scenery." We'll know we've achieved Stegner's ideal when our Alberta headwaters streams are once more healthy, clean, teeming with native trout, and flowing confidently to a future in which we can all take pride in how we use the green and living land from which those streams rise.